Autumn 1805. Napoleon had already shattered the main Austrian army at Ulm, opening the road to Austrian capital. With Vienna now exposed, Emperor Francis II abandoned the city and retreated northeast, hoping to unite with the approaching Russian army under Alexander I. On November 13, French forces entered Vienna almost without resistance. Capturing the imperial capital gave Napoleon supplies, bridges, and one of the most important strategic positions in Central Europe. As Napoleon occupied Vienna, the Austrian Emperor escaped to the northeast. At the same time, Russian forces continued advancing to join their allies. The coalition armies were finally concentrating into a single force. Napoleon immediately marched after them. Rather than allowing the coalition to regroup, he sought to force a decisive battle before additional Russian reinforcements could arrive. By early December, the French army reached the fields near the small Moravian town of Austerlitz. There, on December 2, 1805, three emperors prepared for one of the most important battles in military history. December 2, 1805. Near a small town called Austerlitz, three emperors prepared for one of the most famous battles in military history. On one side stood Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France. On the other stood the combined armies of Austria and Russia, led by Emperor Francis II and Tsar Alexander I. Together, the coalition outnumbered Napoleon. Many believed the French emperor had finally met an enemy too strong to defeat. By the end of the day, they would discover they had walked directly into one of the most famous, greatest military traps ever devised. The Battle of Austerlitz would become known as Napoleon's masterpiece, not because he had the larger army, but because he convinced his enemies to make exactly the mistake he wanted. Only weeks before the battle, Napoleon had entered Vienna almost without resistance. But capturing the Austrian capital didn't end the war. A massive coalition army was approaching from the east. Russian forces joined the Austrians, creating an army larger than Napoleon's one. For the first time in years, the French emperor faced the possibility of defeat. Instead of searching for stronger defensive positions, Napoleon did something unexpected. He deliberately weakened his right flank. From a distance it appeared vulnerable. The coalition commanders believed they had found the perfect opportunity. If they attacked the French right, they could cut Napoleon off from Vienna and destroy his army, exactly as Napoleon hoped. Everything they saw had been carefully planned. The battle had already begun before the first shot was fired. The Allied commanders believed Napoleon's right flank was dangerously weak. Confident they had found the perfect opportunity, they committed the bulk of their army to a massive attack against the French right. Russian and Austrian columns began advancing south, intending to turn Napoleon's flank, cut his lines of retreat, and crush the French army from the side. But this was exactly what Napoleon had hoped for. While the Allies continued shifting more troops toward their offensive, the French army quietly prepared for its own decisive move. Soult's corps gathered opposite the Pratzen Heights, waiting for the Emperor's signal, while Marshal Davout's exhausted troops marched rapidly toward the threatened right flank. As the coalition columns pushed further south, the center of their line became increasingly exposed. Every battalion committed to the attack weakened the forces still holding the Pratzen Heights. Napoleon watched patiently, allowing the trap to close around his opponents. Finally, Shortly before 9 o'clock of the morning, Napoleon gave the order. French columns surged forward toward the Pratzen Heights. At the same time, fierce fighting erupted across the battlefield. On the northern flank, Marshal Lannes advanced against Prince Bagration Russians, while Davout struggled to hold the French right against overwhelmed Allied numbers. The Pratzen Heights quickly became the center of the battle. French infantry climbed the slopes under heavy artillery fire. Muskets' volleys echoed across the hills as soldiers fought at close range for control of the high ground. Neither side was willing to give an inch. To the north, Lannes and Bagration became locked in an equally brutal struggle. Cavalry charges, artillery bombardments, and repeated infantry assaults turned the battlefield into chaos. On the French right, the battle reached its most desperate phase. Davout exhausted soldiers, many of whom had marched for nearly 2 days to reach the battlefield, struggled to contain repeated Allied assaults. Cannon fire and musket volleys were tore through both armies, yet the French line somehow held. Every minute the defenders remained in position brought Napoleon closer to victory. Their mission was not to advance. It was simply to survive long enough for the decisive blow to succeed elsewhere. That decisive blow was already unfolding in the center. French infantry finally secured the Pratzen Heights, driving the Allied formation from the plateau. What had begun as a tactical setback quickly became a strategic disaster for the coalition. From the heights, Napoleon could now dominate the entire battlefield. The Allied army was effectively split into 2 isolated wings, making coordinated resistance almost impossible. Meanwhile, fierce combat continued in the north. Marshal Lannes pressed relentlessly against Prince Bagration troops. Muskets fired almost continuously as artillery battered both sides and cavalry searched for opportunity to break the enemy's line. Gradually, French pressure began to tell. Coalition units started falling back under repeated attacks, while French cavalry pushed forward to exploit every opening. With the center firmly under French control, Napoleon ordered his forces to expand the breakthrough. French formations advanced together, steadily forcing the coalition back across the battlefield. Yet, the fighting was far from over. On the southern flank, Allied columns continued pressing against the weakened French right, hoping to achieve at least one local success before the entire situation collapsed. Napoleon responded immediately. Reinforcements rushed toward the threatened sector, strengthening the exhausted defenders just as the pressure reached its peak. Seeing fresh French troops entering the fight, the Allied advance finally stalled. The initiative passed completely to Napoleon's army, which immediately launched a determined counterattack. Artillery thundered across the battlefield as French infantry and cavalry drove relentlessly forward, forcing the coalition into an increasingly disorganized withdrawal. In the north, Bagration recognized the danger. With the French breakthrough threatening his rear, he ordered a fighting withdrawal to preserve what remained of his forces. Even during the retreat, the northern battle remained intense. French troops continued pressing forward while Bagration's experienced soldiers repeatedly turned to fire disciplined volleys. Before falling back once again. Step by step, however, French superiority became impossible to resist. The coalition steadily abandoned its position, while Napoleon forces occupied the ground they had fought so hard to capture. The retreat soon accelerated as more and more Allied formations began pulling away from the battlefield. In the north, the arrival of French reinforcements transformed defense into attack. The Allied columns that had spent the morning advancing were now struggling simply to escape encirclement. By midday, the outcome of the Battle of Austerlitz was no longer in doubt. Across the entire front, coalition forces began a general retreat. What had started as an ambitious offensive had ended in complete defeat. Napoleon's masterpiece had unfolded almost exactly as he had planned. By deliberately weakening his own right flank and tempting the Allied into a massive attack, he had lured them away from the Pratzen Heights before striking directly through the center. The victory at Austerlitz destroyed the Third Coalition, forced Austria to seek peace, and firmly established Napoleon as the dominant military commander in Europe. The Battle of Austerlitz was over. The surviving Russian forces began a long retreat toward the east, eventually returning to Russian territory. The Austrian army also withdrew, leaving Napoleon in complete control of the battlefield. Less than a month later, Austria signed the Treaty of Pressburg, ending its participation in the War of the Third Coalition. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened by years of conflict, would collapse the following year after nearly 1,000 years of existence. Napoleon's victory of Austerlitz reshaped the balance of power in Europe. More than just a battlefield triumph, it became one of the greatest military masterpieces ever executed, one that is still studied in military academies around the world today.